For nearly 2,000 years, one name has stood as the universal symbol of betrayal, not simply a villain among many. The villain, the archetype against which every subsequent traitor in Western culture gets measured. Dante placed him at the very center of the ninth circle of hell, frozen in the mouth of Satan himself, chewed for eternity. 30 pieces of silver became shorthand for the price of selling out the sacred. His name became a verb. To betray someone completely, absolutely, unforgivably, is simply to Judas them. And yet, in 1978, in a cave near the Egyptian village of Carrara, a leather-bound papyrus codex surfaced on the black market. It changed hands for decades, deteriorated in poor storage conditions, was nearly lost entirely, and finally reached scholars and conservators who spent years painstakingly reconstructing its fragile pages. What it contained, once translated and published in 2006, was a gospel attributed to Judas Iscariot. Not a gospel that confirms his guilt, a gospel that inverts it completely. In this text, Jesus does not merely tolerate Judas. He trusts him above every other disciple. He tells him things he withholds from the rest. And the act that Christianity has spent 2 millennia condemning as the ultimate sin, Judas's betrayal, leading directly to the crucifixion, is described in this gospel not as treachery, but as assistance, a necessary, painful, deeply misunderstood act that Judas alone had the spiritual capacity to carry out. If this reading is even partially correct, then the most hated man in religious history was, in fact, the most trusted. What the Codex Tchacos contains, the Gospel of Judas, is one of 4 texts preserved in what scholars call the Codex Tchacos, a Coptic papyrus manuscript dated to around 300 AD. Though most scholars believe the original text was composed considerably earlier, likely in the 2nd century, placing it in roughly the same era as the Gospel of Mary and the flourishing of the Valentinian schools we've explored previously. The text opens by explicitly framing itself as secret. It claims to record the secret discourse of pronouncement by Jesus in conversation with Judas Iscariot, a private teaching, distinct from what Jesus taught publicly to the other disciples. This framing alone places the Gospel of Judas within the same genre as the Gospel of Mary and the Apocryphon of James, texts describing an esoteric transmission given selectively to a specific disciple, rather than a public teaching intended for general consumption. The pattern is by now familiar. Jesus gives his deepest instruction not to the institutional hierarchy that would later claim exclusive authority, but to individuals who demonstrated the spiritual capacity to receive it. In the Gospel of Mary, that individual was a woman the male disciples resented. In the Gospel of Judas, that individual is the disciple history would spend 2,000 years vilifying. The text describes Jesus laughing at the other disciples' misunderstanding of prayer and worship, a recurring motif in Gnostic literature, where Jesus' laughter signals his amusement at the disciples' attachment to conventional religious practice rather than genuine gnosis. It describes Jesus explaining cosmology to Judas alone, an account of the divine realms, the nature of the material world, and the structure of what exists beyond it, echoing the Sethian and Valentinian cosmological frameworks found throughout the Nag Hammadi library. And then it arrives at the passage that has generated the most controversy in the scholarly and popular reception of this text. You will exceed all of them, Jesus tells Judas directly. You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. Consider what this sentence actually claims. Jesus describes his physical body as clothing, a garment worn by something deeper. something not identical to the material form. This is precisely the Gnostic anthropology we've encountered repeatedly. The divine spark, temporarily housed in physical form, not identical with the body it inhabits. Sacrificing the man that clothes me is Jesus describing his own crucifixion, not as a tragedy inflicted upon him against his will by a traitor's greed, but as an act he is actively requesting help to accomplish. The body must be released for the divine spark within to complete its return to the pleroma. Someone has to perform the act that releases it. Jesus asks Judas to be that someone, not because Judas is corrupt enough to betray a friend for money, because Judas is spiritually developed enough to understand what the other disciples cannot yet grasp, that the crucifixion is not a defeat to be prevented, but a necessary threshold to be crossed, and that performing the act that triggers it requires someone capable of understanding its true significance, rather than reacting to its apparent horror. "You will exceed all of them" is not sarcasm. It is the text's explicit claim that Judas possessed a level of spiritual understanding beyond the other 11 disciples combined, precisely because he alone could see past the surface tragedy to the liberation underneath it. Why the other disciples couldn't do it. The Gospel of Judas is explicit about why this task fell to Judas specifically, and not to Peter, John, or any of the other disciples who receive far more prominent treatment in the canonical Gospels. The text describes the other disciples as remaining trapped in a limited understanding of Jesus' mission, expecting a political liberator, a restorer of Israel's earthly kingdom, a figure whose triumph would look like conventional victory rather than apparent defeat. When Jesus describes his true nature and mission to them, they respond with confusion, fear, or outright rejection. Judas alone, in this text, correctly identifies Jesus' origin. When Jesus asks the disciples who he truly is, the others offer inadequate answers. Judas responds, "You are from the immortal realm of Barbello, and I am not worthy to utter the name of the one who has sent you." This is not a small detail. In Gnostic cosmology, Barbello represents one of the highest emanations of the pleroma, the divine mother principle, the first thought of the ineffable source. For Judas to correctly identify Jesus as originating from this realm, while the other disciples fail to grasp even the basic nature of who they are following, positions him as the single most spiritually perceptive member of the entire group. This is the text's central claim, and it inverts the entire hierarchy the institutional church later built. Peter, the disciple who would become, in official church history, the first pope, the foundation of institutional authority, is portrayed in the Gospel of Judas as one of the disciples who fundamentally misunderstands what Jesus is teaching. Judas, the disciple institutional Christianity made synonymous with damnation, is portrayed as the only one who genuinely comprehends it. The politics of betrayal to understand why this reading was buried so thoroughly. Look at what the traditional betrayal narrative accomplishes structurally for the institution that preserved and canonized it. If Judas is simply corrupt, motivated by greed, easily manipulated by 30 pieces of silver, morally weak in a way that makes his betrayal comprehensible and condemnable, then the crucifixion becomes a straightforward morality tale. Evil forces, Judas, the Jewish authorities in the traditional and historically damaging reading, the Roman state, conspire against pure goodness, Jesus, and the resulting martyrdom becomes the foundation for a doctrine of atonement. An innocent, betrayed victim whose suffering purchases salvation for those who believe in him. This framework requires Judas's villainy to be uncomplicated. The moral clarity of the entire atonement narrative depends on the traitor being simply unambiguously bad. But if Judas is instead the most spiritually advanced disciple, acting on Jesus' direct instruction, performing a necessary act of liberation rather than a betrayal, then the crucifixion narrative becomes something categorically different, not a tragedy that evil inflicted on innocents. A collaborative act understood and consented to by both participants, aimed at completing a specific spiritual purpose, releasing the divine spark from its temporary bodily housing. That version of events does not support a doctrine of vicarious atonement in the way institutional Christianity required. It supports something closer to the Gnostic understanding we've traced throughout this exploration, the crucifixion as demonstration rather than sacrifice, as a specific instance of the universal process by which the divine spark, trapped in every human body, must eventually be liberated from material identification. You cannot build a religion of guilt, sin, and vicarious atonement on a story where the crucifixion was a jointly planned liberation event. The traditional Judas had to remain a villain because the theological structure built on top of the crucifixion required an unambiguous villain to make sense. The historical Judas problem set the Gospel of Judas aside for a moment and look at the canonical accounts themselves, because even there, the story does not hold together as cleanly as the popular narrative suggests. The canonical Gospels cannot agree on Judas's motive. Matthew emphasizes greed, 30 pieces of silver. Luke and John introduce the idea that Satan entered Judas, externalizing responsibility for the act onto a supernatural force rather than Judas's own character. Mark offers no clear motive at all. Matthew's gospel adds a detail that sits uneasily with the greed narrative. After the betrayal, Judas is overcome with such profound remorse that he attempts to return the silver, is refused, throws the money into the temple, and hangs himself. This is not the behavior pattern typically associated with straightforward avarice. It is the behavior of someone who did something he believed, at the time, needed to be done, and who then could not bear the psychological weight of having done it, or of watching the consequence unfold in a way he had not anticipated. Acts of the Apostles offers yet another account of Judas's death, inconsistent with Matthew's version, describing him falling and bursting open in a field purchased with the betrayal money, rather than hanging himself. The canonical tradition itself cannot settle on a coherent account of why Judas did what he did or how he died afterward. This inconsistency is precisely the kind of gap that later theological interpretation rushes to fill with the simplest available narrative: greed, guilt, damnation, while the actual historical record remains genuinely ambiguous. The Gospel of Judas does not resolve every question, but it demonstrates that alternative readings existed within the earliest Christian communities, readings sophisticated enough to trouble scholars and translators for decades, and dangerous enough that this text, too, had to be buried in the Egyptian desert alongside its Gnostic companions. What it means if Judas understood, if the Gospel of Judas preserves even a fragment of authentic early tradition. The implications extend well beyond a single disciple's reputation. It suggests that the earliest Christian communities were far more diverse, theologically adventurous, and willing to interrogate the meaning of the crucifixion than the flattened, unanimous narrative that later became orthodox doctrine. It suggests that questions about the nature of Jesus' body, the purpose of his death, and the relative spiritual development of his closest followers were live, contested questions rather than settled facts, questions with multiple serious answers circulating simultaneously in the 2nd century, before institutional consolidation reduced that diversity to a single sanctioned account. And it suggests something more personally unsettling if you sit with it honestly. Every tradition we've explored, Mary's private transmission, the Valentinian tripartite anthropology, the bridal chamber's requirement of genuine inner readiness, describes spiritual understanding as something that develops unevenly. Some people, in any given community, are further along than others. That is not a comfortable teaching for institutions built on the premise that spiritual status should track institutional rank. It is an even less comfortable teaching for individuals because it raises the possibility that the person a community has designated as most trustworthy, most authoritative, most central to the official narrative might not be the person who actually understands the deepest teaching. And the person a community has designated as its villain, its outcast, its cautionary tale, might be the one who understood it best of all. That is precisely the reversal the Gospel of Judas proposes. The betrayal that wasn't here is what changes if you allow this reading room to breathe. The crucifixion was not something done to Jesus by an unwitting or malicious accomplice. It was something Jesus asked for, understood clearly, and required a specific kind of disciple to help him accomplish. Someone who could see past the apparent horror of the act to its actual purpose. Someone willing to bear the weight of being permanently misunderstood by everyone who came after. Someone whose name would become synonymous with betrayal precisely because he performed the one act of genuine understanding that made the entire liberation possible. That is an extraordinarily heavy burden to carry. Perhaps the heaviest any disciple in this entire tradition was asked to bear. Heavier than Mary's grief. Heavier than Peter's guilt after his own denial. Heavier than any other figure in the story except Jesus himself. If the Gospel of Judas is even partially right, then Judas Iscariot did not fail the test of loyalty. He passed a test none of the other disciples were spiritually prepared to take. And he has spent 2,000 years paying, in reputation, in damnation, in the permanent linguistic legacy of his own name, for having understood something the rest of history was not ready to hear. The traitor may have been the truest friend in the entire story. See you in the next one.